Kia ora koutou. My name is Carey Ann Morrison and I am the Senior Researcher at Imagine Better. I'm delighted to have the opportunity today to speak to Jen Margaret as part of our Disability Ally campaign. For the last 6 months, Imagine Better has been exploring the role of non-disabled allies and the disability rights movement. We've heard from people with a close connection to the disability rights movement, including disabled people as well as parents of disabled children and adults. But we also wanted to think more broadly about being an ally and what those of us involved in the disability rights movement could learn from allies and other identity-based social movements. The work of other social movements, especially Indigenous, race, gender, and rainbow social justice, all confirm the importance of allies for progressing social justice agendas. Today, Jen has generously offered to speak to her experiences as a non-Indigenous ally supporting Māori rights. Welcome, Jen, and thank you so much for agreeing to be involved. Could you begin by introducing yourself and talking about your work as an ally supporting Māori and Indigenous rights?
Tēnā koe. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko hui hui mai nei ki te whakarongo ki tēnei kōrero. He mihi hoki ki te mana whenua o tēnā rohi o tēnā rohi, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko Jen Margaret tukunua, he Pākehā hau I tipu aki au, kata ki Ototahi ki te whanganui Aotearoa noho anō nānei. Greetings to you all who are watching this, and acknowledgements to mana whenua of all the rohi that people might be joining this from, and also to mana whenua of the rohi that I grew up in Canterbury, on the Canterbury Plains, and also where I live now in Te Whanganui Aotearoa. I'm Pākehā of Danish, English and German ancestry, lots of other bits of ish in the mix. In terms of this work, I've been involved since first learning about Te Tiriti or Waitangi at a university paper in the 90s, got active at that time in building understanding of non-Indigenous people, particularly of Pākehā, particularly my own people of Te Tiriti or Waitangi, and then became more involved over time connecting with the movements of others who've been doing this work for some time, particularly when I moved to Tamaki Makaurau, to Auckland. And I suppose as I speak and acknowledging this work to recognise that this is collective work, and so while I'm speaking from my experience, I really want to acknowledge all of the people that have and continue to shape my experience in this work, both tangata whenua and tangata tiriti, people who have been leaders and supporters of this work for long before me, and yeah, so just to acknowledge all of those people. In terms of the work and the opportunities that I suppose I've had to learn from others, I in 2010 had the opportunity to go to Canada and the US and talk to non-Indigenous people doing work in support of Indigenous rights, and that learning from that context I brought into the learning that obviously I was doing alongside others here, and then also had the opportunity a couple of years after that to meet with people in Australia doing that similar work, and brought those learnings together in a book called Working as Allies. Supporters of Indigenous Justice Reflect. And so that work talks to people obviously working in this sphere, particularly of non-Indigenous people working in support of Indigenous justice. But I have had the feedback from people who are working across a range of sectors that some of the principles of this work, of what it means to be a person not directly affected by the injustice, but working to address injustice, the feedback's been that there's obviously some common kind of ideas and themes that work across. So yeah, that's a little bit of the context to this work and to doing this work.
Yeah, fantastic, thank you. And do you think that you could talk a little bit about some of the qualities or skills that you think are important to being an ally, or some of the stuff that has been shared with you across those three geographical and cultural settings.
I suppose one of the things that's important when we come to this conversation is to actually reflect on that term ally, and how sometimes it's one of the conversations that we have with people, and it's a very active conversation around, is that a useful term, and some of the issues with that term. And I think when people have talked to different words that might be used, what it really comes back to is that critically this is about action. And so one of the things is that it's not something, a label or claiming an identity for oneself. It can be useful, I think, for people to actually see their particular role, but that role is about action, and it's a relational term. So it's really for the people who are directly affected by the justice issue to be able to determine whether you are an ally or not, rather than something that I might call myself. So I suppose it's just thinking about that term itself and how we're using it. In terms of some of the qualities that people reflected on as being useful for this work, a critical part, and it's a message that we've always had from tangata whenua to Pākehā and to other tangata Tiriti non-Māori, is the importance of actually understanding ourselves and knowing our own stories and know what we bring to the relationship. And part of knowing ourselves is the stories of how society responds and is shaped often by our dominance. And when I say that, I mean in a collective kind of sense. And so what that might mean for the defaults and what's normal and ordinary to us. And so really understanding that is quite important to engaging in work for change. Understanding our defaults, our normal, and also understanding how that sits within a society that supports our defaults and our normal if we're part of a dominant culture group. And so what that then means for the relationship. I think it's important to understand our motivations for engaging in the work, and to be really clear about obviously the aspects of ourselves that draw ourselves to that work, but to be able to challenge that, and to be not feeling like we need approval or even gratitude from those who we're working to achieve and to support change for and alongside. So I think actually it's about being quite grounded in the work. One of the things, if you hold privilege, is that society is shaped to your norms, and you're often used to being right. And I talk particularly as Pākehā in this space that it is about sort of our ways having been right. That's why they were imposed with the idea that they were right. And so actually moving away from the idea of kind of knowing and rightness to being open to completely different ways of seeing and being in the world, and different experiences, and all of that being, all of those different ways of being having equal validity to the ways that we as dominant culture people might experience or being in the world, is a critical part of the work as well. And so, and also to being kind of, I suppose, challenged, because we need to be, because those defaults can be so strong, and they're so often supported by all the messages that we get in the media, and just the ways that the world around us functions to privilege us. So an awareness of that, an openness to learning, hearing, seeing other ways of being. And I think too, actually a commitment to being in this for the long haul, that this isn't just sort of a thing that is about a campaign, or it's lifelong work, and it's also in that lifelong work that you need to keep working on. So it's not just that you do a bit of learning and then you've got your stuff sorted out. This is lifelong kind of practices to keep challenging in ourselves. So I think all of those things are important aspects. I don't know if they're all qualities, but some of those qualities that are in there, I think, one of the lines that someone shared with me when they were talking about the importance of humility, when I was talking to others around this, they shared the line of being passionately aware that you could be, you know, completely wrong. So having that awareness and that openness is critical, and that humility too.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, certainly what you just identified there, some of the themes have come up and across the discussions we have around, you know, the importance of deep critical self-reflection, the role of privilege and power, both at an individual level and at a structural community level, remaining deeply curious, you know, and open to learning. So yeah, and also around the issue of that lifelong commitment. So not, you know, not being able, people with lived experience are not able to step out of the movement, out of the challenges and the issues. And so as an ally, you know, having a commitment to remaining in, you know, in the fight for justice as well along the way. So yeah, thank you. Could you talk about some of the challenges you face as an ally, and how you go about addressing some of those challenges?
I think your beautiful summation just then actually picked up on some of those, and one is that obviously critically, when we're involved in this work, we are working to address power imbalance and injustice, and so that in itself is a challenge, because we're needing to do that at the personal level and how it manifests in our interactions, but we're critically trying to shift that more broadly in society. And in doing that, challenging power is something that can elicit, you know, strong reactions from people if you're publicly working to do that. And it also is something that is a challenge to do when you're carrying power yourself. So some of the challenges kind of walking a line of actually talking to other people in your own community and your dominant community. So I speak as Pākehā, like talking to other Pākehā has been something that we do and continue to do in response to calls from tangata whenua to support the work in that way. And so keeping doing that focus on where we are best positioned to affect change, but doing that in a way that doesn't necessarily or doesn't reinforce our power. I suppose that's also in a way that kind of decenters Pākehā power in the context that I'm talking about. So there's challenges in walking and holding relationships and speaking to our own people, holding relationships with tangata whenua, and being connected and relational in our work. So working out, as some people articulated, about when to step up and when to be speaking and when to step back. Working out the lines of, of when we're leading and what spaces it's appropriate for us to lead, and in what spaces it's critical that the role of the ally is to be, you know, peeling the potatoes or in the back. And I think one of the things that can arise, and it's quite an active issue I think at the moment when I look at some of what's in the media, is that sometimes that, for instance, in a movement, if there has been leadership by Pākehā, for instance, or by a dominant group where there's been leadership, and then things change and there's a call to a move for leadership by those most directly impacted by an issue, it can be seen as kind of weakness or failure for structures to change. And there's been a whole lot of energy sometimes creating movements, creating structures for change. And so I think being able to see those points of when to step back and to actually see that that's can be a sign of maturity, to say we don't actually, this is success, that we don't have to be leading, that, you know, that we can play a different role at this point. So I'm not sure if that's kind of clear or if there's any clarification that you'd like to make in terms of that point, but I think it's really that there's always this critical play with power, with voice, with remaining really, really connected to what's needed for those by those who are directly impacted by the issue and who we're working to support. And you can't do that without having relationships or being really connected to actually listening. I think sometimes as people in the ally role think that, oh yeah, well, you know, you've got to have someone on speed dial to answer all those relational questions. But there's a lot that we can be accessing by constantly listening to Māori leadership that comes through us through media and through a range of ways. So keeping ourselves really informed of the issues is really important to be shaping and to be clear that we're being responsive.
So doing some of that labour yourself, research, trying to understand the issue as opposed to always relying on somebody to directly inform you.
Yeah, and it's a balance. Obviously it's relational, but I think that sometimes what I see is this sort of thing that people on the allies side may expect our partners to be doing all of that education work rather than actually doing quite a lot of the base stuff and coming into the conversation with some thinking, you know. And I think there were some beautiful quotes actually from people. I might share one and from someone that I interviewed in the Allies book. And this is Prue Gell, a woman who works in Australia. And she said, it took me a long time of working in Indigenous rights activism to realise that I do come in with a set of skills. I don't come as an empty vessel to this work. I think fear of being an obtrusive, offensive white person for a long time had me thinking that that just meant sitting and listening. So actually being clear about why we're there and what we do bring, and seeing if their offering is what's needed and wanted and relevant is quite important. So yeah, again, it's the kind of lines of that not being a dominant thing, also being responsive in the relationship, but not being totally passive and so yeah.
So I think that you know, that relational aspect that you were just talking about connects nicely into the next question around knowing whether the work that you're doing or your contribution or your set of skills that you bring is actually beneficial to the people that you support. Could you reflect on that?
I think really the way that you know that is by people telling you. I mean, that's and being open and having clear ways that people can provide feedback in a range of ways. And again, I think sometimes we can expect that to be direct, and sometimes it will be direct feedback from the people that we are working alongside. But also it's about listening for the silences too, and understanding and probing those. And sometimes those silences might be because other people are super busy and it's absolutely fine what you're doing. Or sometimes those silences might be because you have done something that's not okay. And so it is actually about sometimes being able to check and keeping it in contact to kind of know about those things. But for me, one of the big things is, you know, the invitations continuing to come from people, and people recommending what we do in terms of, and I'm talking here about Te Tiriti workshops to other, you know, Māori, recommending them to other Māori. So those are sort of some of the things that obviously demonstrate trust, that are very much about a kind of an active, well, it's based on the action that we're taking, I suppose, and it's a response to that action. So I think it's really just, those are some of the ways, hearing back directly, indirectly, and having mechanisms for feedback as well.
And so do you think it's all right for people to continue along in their ally work if they don't get any feedback about whether it's going all right, you know, right, or they could be changing? Is there a point at which people, you know, should stop?
I suppose the question I would have if there's no feedback is, where are the relationships? So, you know, it's as I say, this is about relational work. So if there's no feedback, it would say, yeah, what's the relationship or where are the relationships? Yeah.
Yeah, awesome.
I'd be wondering about that, and maybe they are, and I don't know. So, but it would be a question about that, I think.
Fantastic. So just to finish up, I'm wondering if you could offer any suggestions or advice for people wanting to become allies in and for movements that they don't have direct and or lived experience in.
I think one of the things is to, obviously in this work, it's about, centering those who are impacted by oppression. And so it is, it's continuing in the work, as I've said before, about that learning and listening around stepping up and stepping back. I think, coming in with that full awareness of the need to be able to let go out of things that might be important ways of working or defaults for you, but that are not necessarily useful to this work. Working collectively, I think, is really important. Like, there would seldom be people coming into this work who are not joining some sort of collective, and I think that that's really critical, the relationships and the connections, not just on the working across between those who are working to support an issue and those directly affected, but also collectivity on the side of those who are not directly affected. And so that collective approach is really important, partly so that there's not a whole lot of individuals who might be placing more burden on people, taking energy of people who are directly impacted by the injustice. And so I think those are important things, and also because there's hopefully useful learning to have from others who have already been engaged in the work. So making those connections is important. I think too, just actually realizing that this work is often intergenerational, it's often very big. So having ways of sustaining yourself in the work in terms of seeing small successes, connecting with others, but being able to sustain yourself is important, because we're not actually, and it's the same with any social justice work, it's not specific to allies, but we're not very useful if we're not actually, making sure that we can healthily kind of contribute the work. And so when I say about being that earlier comment about having long-term commitment, it's also recognizing that that's part of sustaining that long-term commitment, is being able to step back, quite literally step back for times and step back, and if that's what's needed to sustain the work over time. Those would probably be some of the key things. And I suppose I say that, and then also acknowledging the comment that you made earlier, that people directly affected by injustice don't get to directly step back from that daily lived experience. So just, kind of holding, I think, being able to hold tensions around all of that is kind of really critical too.
Yeah, thank you. And I think certainly your reflection on relationships and collectivity and shared learnings is one of the great things that I'm able to take from our kōrero today, and also hopefully the rest of our listeners and people who have tuned in to hear our conversation. So thanks again, Jen. It's been a real privilege speaking to you today, and look forward to hearing about more of the work you do with and alongside Māori and in the Indigenous rights movement. So kia ora.
Kia ora, thank you. And just to say, if people are interested on the Groundwork website, groundwork.org.nz, in the resources section, there are more resources around working as allies. And so if people want some other resources, there's a webinar there that I did with Julia Whaipote. So that's a direct conversation with someone that I work alongside in this mahi. So if you're interested in all of those things, there's another place to continue this learning. Ka nui te mahi kia koe, kia koutou katoa. Kia ora.